Hey guys, tonight we step back into the shadowed corridors of history. To witness the final days of one of England's most legendary rulers, Queen Elizabeth I. Her reign saw the rise of empire, the flourishing of art, and the forging of a nation's identity. But behind the crown and the power lay a woman whose final moments remain one of history's most haunting royal endings. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to relax, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle in for tonight's journey. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far our stories reach across the world. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and imagine the winter of 1602, the grand halls of Richmond Palace shrouded in silence, the whispers of mortality creeping through its stone walls, and a queen who once commanded empires now facing the quiet descent of her final days. In the winter of 1602, the grand halls of Richmond Palace lay shrouded in shadows. Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, now approached her 70th year, a remarkable age in a time when few lived so long. Her reign had been a tapestry of triumphs and trials, woven with threads of war, art, and political mastery. Yet, in those final months, the vibrant threads began to unravel, and whispers of mortality crept through the court. Her skin, once powdered to perfection, now revealed the fragility beneath the mask. The brilliant auburn wigs she adorned for decades sat atop a body that had weathered nearly half a century of rule. Her iron will, which had once outmatched rivals and silenced dissenters, now seemed to waver. Though her mind remained sharp, her presence at court grew sporadic, her appetite waned, and the fire that once burned so fiercely appeared to flicker and fade. By January of 1603, rumors began to swirl through the drafty corridors of Richmond Palace. The Queen, it was said, was fading. She had suffered losses that cut deep, the execution of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, 2 years prior had struck a blow from which she never fully recovered. Though he had led a rebellion against her, there was an affection, some whispered it was motherly, others believed it was something deeper, that tethered her to him. His death haunted her. Some claimed she murmured his name in the stillness of night, her voice thin and cracking with grief. In those bleak winter weeks, Elizabeth spent long hours standing, her gaze fixed upon the stone walls or the flickering flames in the hearth. Servants noted that she refused to sleep, refused to eat, and rarely sat. When she did speak, her voice was but a whisper, trailing off as if the weight of her years pulled the words from her lips. Her ladies-in-waiting, once bustling with chatter and duty, now moved in silence, their eyes cast downward, their hands trembling as they adjusted her silks and lace. Physicians were summoned, offering tinctures and tonics, whispering prayers that did little to halt the slow ebb of her strength. She waved them away, rejecting their remedies with the same defiance she had shown the Spanish Armada. Ministers urged her to name a successor, to solidify the realm's future, but she only shook her head, retreating deeper into her solitude. Her refusal became a shadow over the court, a whisper of uncertainty that festered in the minds of those who feared the chaos of a power vacuum. As the frost of February settled over England, Richmond Palace grew colder, both in temperature and spirit. Fires burned low in the great halls, and the flickering candlelight seemed to stretch the shadows into mournful shapes. Elizabeth's once lively court had become somber, whispers of discontent and fear replacing the music and laughter that once filled the corridors. Courtiers, once bold in their ambitions, now moved cautiously, their voices hushed as if afraid their words might hasten the inevitable. The Queen's condition did not go unnoticed beyond the palace walls. In taverns and marketplaces, speculation ran wild. Some claimed she was cursed, others whispered of poison, while the most superstitious murmured that the Virgin Queen had made a pact with darker forces and that the time had come for her reckoning. But within the palace, the truth was far less mysterious. Elizabeth was simply old, her body giving way to the ravages of time, her spirit dimmed by the burden of decades spent ruling alone. One evening, as the winds howled through the palace gardens, Elizabeth summoned her most trusted ladies. They entered her chambers to find her standing by the window, her frail form silhouetted against the pale glow of moonlight. She did not turn as they approached, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon as if searching for something long lost. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice no louder than a whisper. "I am not afraid to die," she said, her gaze still locked on the darkness beyond. "I have seen enough, lived enough. But I will not go quietly." Her words, though soft, carried the weight of a promise. Her ladies, eyes brimming with tears, bowed their heads, understanding the gravity of what she had spoken. Elizabeth had faced down armies, plotted against traitors, and ruled a nation that had risen to dominance under her hand. She would face death with the same resolve, with dignity, with defiance, and with the iron will that had carried her through the storms of her reign. As the moonlight crept along the stone floor, Elizabeth finally turned from the window, her eyes sharper than they had been in weeks. "Bring me my robes," she commanded, her voice steadier now. "And light the fires. I will not greet death as a shadow, but as a queen." The ladies hurried to fulfill her wishes, their hands shaking as they laid out the silks and jewels she had worn during her days of triumph. Elizabeth watched them with a calmness that belied her frailty, her eyes glimmering with the fire that had once burned so brightly. She would not surrender, not to time, not to illness, and certainly not to fear. That night, as the fires blazed and the shadows retreated, Elizabeth sat upright in her chair, her gaze unyielding, her presence regal. And though her body was frail and her strength waning, she remained, until dawn, the very embodiment of the crown she had worn for 44 years. The morning after Elizabeth's display of defiance, word spread quickly through Richmond Palace. Courtiers whispered of her resolve, some in awe, others in fear. "The old lioness still has her claws," one of the guards murmured to another as they passed the great hall. Ministers who had grown weary of waiting for a succession now moved with a renewed sense of urgency. They convened in secret chambers, their voices hushed but insistent. The Queen's strength, though admirable, was fleeting. Time, they agreed, was no longer on her side. Yet Elizabeth refused to yield. She attended court with a dignity that masked her weakening frame, her auburn wig set firmly atop her head, her gown heavy with jewels and embroidered emblems of her power. Though her steps were slow, and her voice often strained, she held her head high, eyes fixed forward as if daring death to come for her. But shadows grew long in Richmond Palace. Physicians, now stationed outside her chambers day and night, exchanged grim looks. Her appetite had dwindled to almost nothing, her hands shook as she lifted even the smallest goblet, and her breathing grew shallow. At times, she would clutch at her chest as if grasping for the strength that had once flowed so easily through her veins. Lady Scrope, her most trusted confidant, rarely left her side. It was she who brushed the Queen's hair each morning, whispering soft words of comfort as strands of gray and white fell away from the comb. Elizabeth would watch the strands drift to the floor with eyes that betrayed nothing. "The crown does not age," she would say, her tone resolute. "Only the one who bears it." Despite her bravado, Elizabeth began to withdraw further into her private chambers. Her throne, once the center of English power, sat empty for weeks at a time. Ministers sent petitions and letters of state that went unread. Ambassadors waited impatiently for audiences that never came. The nation held its breath, fearing the uncertainty that would follow her death. Outside the palace, London swelled with tension. Rumors spread like wildfire. Elizabeth had been poisoned, some claimed, others whispered of a curse laid upon the Tudors. In the markets and taverns, men spoke in hushed tones of James VI of Scotland, speculating if he would take the throne peacefully or by force. The specter of civil war hung heavy in the air, like the gathering of a storm that threatened to break at any moment. In February, Elizabeth's condition worsened. Physicians begged her to take to her bed, to rest and preserve what strength she had left. But she refused. "I will not lie down," she told them firmly. To lie down is to surrender. Instead, she stood for hours at a time, sometimes leaning against the walls of her chamber, her hands gripping the cold stone as if it might anchor her to this world a little longer. Her stubbornness confounded her doctors. They spoke in whispers of humors and imbalances, of melancholia and age, but none dared suggest that the Queen relinquish her command. Ministers grew more desperate, pleading with her to name a successor. She met their entreaties with silence. To speak of succession was to speak of death, and Elizabeth refused to acknowledge that death had drawn near. But Lady Scrope saw the truth. Each evening, she watched the Queen's hands tremble more violently, saw the pallor that crept over her once vibrant face. And each evening, she prepared Elizabeth for bed, brushing her hair and laying her gowns across the chair by the fire, knowing full well that the morning might bring a nation in mourning. One night, as the winds howled through the stone corridors of Richmond, Elizabeth called Lady Scrope to her side. Her voice was thin, the words slipping from her lips like fragile wisps of smoke. "Do you believe in ghosts, Scrope?" Lady Scrope, startled by the question, hesitated before answering. "I believe, Your Majesty, that spirits linger where unfinished business remains." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze fixed on the fire that crackled in the hearth. "Then it is settled," she murmured. "I shall not rest, not even in death." Her words hung in the air, a chilling promise that sent a shiver through Lady Scrope's bones. Yet she did not question her queen, for she knew that Elizabeth's will was a force that defied both man and fate. Outside, the snow began to fall, blanketing the gardens of Richmond in a silence so profound it seemed as if the world itself were holding its breath. Within, Elizabeth continued her vigil, standing long into the night, her eyes unyielding, her spirit unbroken. The ministers waited. The physicians prayed. And Elizabeth stood, unmoving, the embodiment of England's will, defying time itself. As winter faded into the chill of early spring, the mood within Richmond Palace grew heavier. Courtiers moved in whispered silence, and the great halls, once filled with music and laughter, were shrouded in an uneasy stillness. Elizabeth, though frail, still refused to take to her bed. She would stand for hours on end, gazing out of the frost-rimed windows, her hands gripping the sill with knuckles pale as ivory. Her ladies-in-waiting watched with anxious eyes, their hands twitching to assist but bound by fear of the Queen's wrath should they suggest she rest. Ministers continued to press her for a declaration of succession. Robert Cecil, her Secretary of State, spoke to her softly, his words measured but firm. "Your Majesty, the realm must have stability. The people, they need assurance of what is to come." Elizabeth's gaze never left the window. "What is to come," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass, "will come whether I will it or not. But it shall not be hastened by my hand." Outside, the whispers grew louder. The common folk gathered in taverns and marketplaces, speculating on the future. Some spoke of James of Scotland, who many believed would claim the throne upon Elizabeth's death. Others spoke of darker plots, of nobles who might rise to challenge the succession, of old grudges that might resurface in the chaos. Fear threaded its way through London like a creeping fog. At court, the power struggle had already begun. Ambassadors from Spain and France maneuvered with careful grace, seeking favor and whispering promises of alliances should the tides of power shift. Spies lurked in shadowed corners, and letters sealed with wax and treachery changed hands in the dead of night. Lady Scrope, always by Elizabeth's side, saw the weight pressing down upon her sovereign. She watched as the Queen's eyes grew more distant, her silences longer, and her gaze more often fixed upon the horizon as if searching for something far beyond mortal reach. One evening, as the fire crackled low in the Queen's chambers, Elizabeth called Lady Scrope to her. "Do you believe, Scrope," she began, her voice soft and distant, "that one's spirit can linger after the body has gone?" Lady Scrope, familiar now with the Queen's musings on mortality, answered with care. "I believe, Your Majesty, that the soul is bound by its own unfinished business. Some find peace, others do not." Elizabeth nodded, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her lace collar. "I have ruled as I must," she whispered, almost to herself. "With iron when needed, with grace when possible. But I fear that my shadow will linger long after I am gone." Lady Scrope did not reply, for there were no words of comfort that could pierce the veil of doubt that had settled over the Queen. Days stretched into weeks, and Elizabeth's health continued its slow, inevitable decline. Physicians were summoned, their hands full of tonics and tinctures, but their remedies were mere whispers against the roar of time. Elizabeth refused them all, waving away their potions with a flick of her thin wrist. "I am not ill," she insisted. "I am eternal." But the court knew better. Ministers began to make preparations, though quietly and without official declaration. Letters were dispatched to Scotland, signaling James VI to prepare for the coming shift of power. Plans were drawn for the funeral rites, the grandest England had ever seen. Yet none dared voice these preparations in the Queen's presence. Her spirit, though caged by age, still held its iron grip. On the morning of March 21, 1603, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to be seated, her strength waning to the point where even standing had become an act of sheer will. She sat by the window, her gaze locked on the horizon. "I will not go to my bed," she whispered to Lady Scrope, who knelt beside her. "I will not." Lady Scrope's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "As you wish, Your Majesty." For 3 days and 3 nights, Elizabeth sat, neither eating nor sleeping, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the world of men. Courtiers moved in silence around her, ministers gathering in antechambers to whisper of what was to come. Priests were summoned but turned away. "Not yet," Elizabeth would murmur, her voice barely above a breath. At last, on the morning of March 24th, as dawn crept through the latticed windows of Richmond Palace, Elizabeth's eyes fluttered shut. Her breathing slowed, then ceased. A silence fell over the room so complete it seemed the walls themselves held their breath. Lady Scrope knelt by her side, her head bowed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Outside, the bells began to toll, their somber tones echoing across the River Thames. The Virgin Queen was dead. Her passing was the end of an era, the closing of the Tudor legacy. England now stood at the precipice of change, the shadow of Elizabeth lingering long after her final breath. The throne would be passed, the crown would be worn by another, but the memory of Elizabeth I, her iron will and unyielding spirit, would echo through the ages. The news of Elizabeth's death spread like wildfire through the cobbled streets of London. Bells tolled from every steeple, and black banners unfurled from the windows of noble houses. The city, so often bustling with trade and gossip, fell into a somber hush. Merchants paused their dealings, artisans set down their tools, and common folk gathered in clusters, their heads bowed in whispered prayer. For many, Elizabeth had been the only monarch they had ever known. Her presence had defined their England, and now that she was gone, the future seemed a shadowy, uncertain place. In the grand halls of Whitehall, preparations were already underway. Robert Cecil, her ever-faithful Secretary of State, moved swiftly and with practiced efficiency. He dispatched riders to Scotland, letters sealed with crimson wax bearing the news to James VI. The crown was his now, the Tudor line had ended, and the age of the Stuarts was about to begin. Not all greeted the news with hope. Among the English nobility, whispers of discontent grew louder. James was an outsider, a Scotsman, one who many feared would bring with him his own advisers, his own customs, and perhaps a new way of ruling that would strip the English court of its power. In the shadowed alcoves of taverns and the hidden chambers of grand estates, plans were whispered, letters exchanged in secrecy, and oaths sworn in the flickering light of candle flames. Thomas Greville, once a trusted adviser to Elizabeth, found himself at the heart of these conspiratorial whispers. He had served the Virgin Queen loyally, his hands stained with the blood of her enemies and his voice tempered with her iron resolve. To him, the idea of a Scottish king sitting on the English throne was nothing short of treachery. Greville met with others of like mind, men and women who had prospered under Elizabeth's reign and feared their fortunes would wither under James. They spoke of tradition, of the sanctity of English blood, and of the dangers of foreign influence. Over tankards of ale and glasses of wine, they plotted in hushed voices, their eyes always watchful, their words always guarded. It was during one of these gatherings, held in the damp cellars of an inn by the Thames, that a plan began to take form. "We cannot allow this Scottish dog to take what is ours," Greville whispered to the group. His voice, though soft, held the iron edge of conviction. Elizabeth built this kingdom with her blood and her will. To hand it over without resistance would be a betrayal of her legacy. The men and women around the table nodded in agreement, their eyes shining with a mixture of fear and resolve. They were merchants, soldiers, lords, and scholars, each bound not by blood but by loyalty to the memory of Elizabeth. Greville leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "We must be swift and decisive. James will bring his own men, his own way of rule. If we are to preserve England as it was, we must act before he can tighten his grip." A murmur of assent rippled through the room. Plans were discussed, names were whispered, alliances considered. Some spoke of assassination, others of rebellion. Greville listened to them all, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table, his mind calculating each risk, each potential reward. "But how?" asked Lord Wharton, a grizzled veteran of Elizabeth's wars with Spain. His hands, scarred and calloused, rested heavily on the table. "James is well protected. His men are loyal, and the people, they seem to welcome him." Greville smiled, a thin, predatory smile that sent a shiver through the room. "The people welcome him because they have not yet seen his true nature," he replied. "All it takes is a whisper, a suggestion of betrayal, a spark to ignite the fire." Wharton nodded slowly. "And who would strike the match?" Greville's eyes narrowed. "We will," he said simply. "But not with swords or daggers. Not yet. First, we must sow the seeds of doubt. Let the people see him as the foreigner he is. Let them believe he means to change their way of life, to take what is rightfully theirs. When the ground is fertile with fear and mistrust, then, and only then, will we act." Outside, the rain began to fall, the droplets tapping against the cobbled streets like the distant echo of war drums. Greville and his co-conspirators sat in silence, their minds heavy with the weight of treason, their hearts steeled with resolve. The storm was coming, and they would be ready. But while Greville plotted in shadows, James VI made his way southward, his entourage stretching across the Scottish border with pomp and fanfare. Trumpets blared and banners flew as he approached London, the promise of uniting England and Scotland under one crown giving him a sense of destiny, of divine right. James was no fool, he knew the whispers of rebellion were real. He had heard the rumors of English nobles meeting in secret, of plans laid in the dead of night. And so, as he approached the capital, he doubled his guard, surrounding himself with trusted men from his Scottish court, their loyalty unquestioned. To many, it seemed the dawn of a new era, one that might bring peace and unity. But beneath the surface, the cracks had already begun to form. The shadow of Elizabeth loomed large over England, her memory casting a pall over the joy of succession. The game was set, the players in place, and in the hidden corners of Whitehall and beyond, the flames of rebellion began to flicker and spark. James VI of Scotland entered London amidst grand celebrations, the streets adorned with banners of crimson and gold. Crowds lined the cobbled roads, cheering and waving as his entourage passed, their voices a chorus of hopeful acceptance. To the common folk, the arrival of James was a promise of continuity, an heir to the throne after the Virgin Queen's long and storied reign. But in the shadows, whispers grew louder. Greville's secret meetings had multiplied, now stretching from the damp cellars of London to the candlelit chambers of noble estates. Letters were sent by trusted hands, sealed with discreet symbols that only those loyal to the cause would recognize. "The usurper must be shown for what he is," Greville would write, his hand steady, his ink bold. "England must not fall to foreign rule without resistance." He had gained allies, men and women who had flourished under Elizabeth's watchful gaze, who now feared losing their status and influence under a Scottish king. Among them were Lord Pembroke, a shrewd statesman known for his sharp tongue and sharper sword, and Lady Arabella Wren, whose connections ran deep within the royal court. Together, they formed a council of resistance, their meetings held in secret, their plans whispered only in the safety of locked chambers. "We must make the people see," Lady Wren would say, her voice a soft whisper that cut through the dim light of their gatherings. "James will strip us of our freedoms, bind us to Scotland's whims, and turn England into a vassal state. We cannot allow it. Greville would nod, his eyes shadowed by the flickering candlelight. The people are swayed by fear, he replied. And fear we shall give them. Their campaign began with whispers, rumors seeded in taverns and markets, tales of James's cruel streak, of his disdain for English customs, of his secret plans to raise taxes and strip land from English lords to gift to his Scottish favourites. Fear began to fester, spreading from town to town like wildfire. Church sermons, once full of praise for the Virgin Queen, now echoed with cautionary tales of foreign rulers who had oppressed their people. The whispers grew louder, suspicions mounting with each passing week. Greville's network extended its reach, spies placed among James's inner circle, reporting every decision, every perceived slight against English tradition. James, for his part, was not blind to the growing unrest. He increased his guard, surrounding himself with men of unshakable loyalty, many of whom he brought with him from Edinburgh. His court became a fortress of Scottish influence, and the English nobility, once so assured of their place, now found themselves sidelined, their council dismissed in favour of Scottish lords whose accents grated in the halls of Whitehall. The tensions reached a peak during the summer of 1603. A proclamation from James's council decreed that certain lands in the northern counties would be repossessed and redistributed under Scottish law. To the English nobility, this was an affront, a direct challenge to their sovereignty and their right to rule their estates as they saw fit. Greville seized the opportunity. He called a gathering of the Council of Resistance, their faces grim in the flickering light of a dozen torches. "The time for whispers is done," he announced, his voice firm. "If James seeks to strip us of our birthright, then we must act before he can seize all we hold dear." Lord Pembroke stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. "Do we speak of open rebellion?" His voice was calm, almost clinical. Greville's eyes were steely. "We speak of preserving England," he replied. "Of ensuring that her legacy is not tainted by foreign hands. Elizabeth fought her entire life to keep this land sovereign. We shall not betray her memory by standing idly by while it crumbles." The room fell silent, the weight of treason heavy upon them. Lady Wren broke the silence, her voice soft but unyielding. "We must be careful. James is no fool. His spies are everywhere, his influence already seeping into the marrow of our court. If we are to move, we must move with precision and without mercy." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Plans were drawn, names were whispered, and oaths were sworn in the dim light of the chamber. It was decided, letters would be sent to sympathetic lords across the realm, calling them to arms. The northern counties would be the first to rise, their disdain for Scottish influence already simmering beneath the surface. But Greville knew it would not be enough to simply resist. A symbol was needed, something to rally behind, something that would ignite the hearts of the people. His eyes settled on Lady Wren. "We need the Queen," he said, his voice resolute. Lady Wren frowned. "Elizabeth is gone," she replied, her tone edged with caution. Greville's smile was thin, almost predatory. "Not Elizabeth," he whispered. "Arabella." The room fell silent as the implication settled over them. Lady Arabella Stuart, cousin to James and a legitimate heir to the English throne. Her claim, though distant, was enough to cause concern. And with enough support, she could be more than just a symbol, she could be a weapon. Lady Wren's eyes glittered with understanding. A queen for England, she murmured. To claim what is rightfully ours. Greville nodded, his gaze unyielding. If the people have a banner to rally behind, they will fight. And we will ensure that banner flies high. The room erupted into whispers, plans unfolding like parchment in the minds of those assembled. The rebellion had found its symbol, its purpose. And soon, very soon, the streets of London would tremble with the footsteps of those ready to fight for the memory of Elizabeth and the future of England. The tide was rising, and the storm was about to break. Lady Arabella Stuart was unaware of the firestorm brewing around her name. She resided quietly at Hardwicke Hall, a grand estate far from the whispers and scheming of London's elite. Her days were filled with routine, morning rides through the mist-covered fields, afternoons spent in the library with volumes of poetry and philosophy, and evenings in the great hall with music and candlelight. Though her life seemed serene, it was anything but simple. Arabella was a cousin to both Elizabeth I and James VI, her bloodline a web of Tudor and Stuart lineage. Her name had been whispered in succession debates for years, but Elizabeth had kept her distant from the throne, wary of her potential claim. Now, with James seated on the throne of England, Arabella remained a mere shadow in the periphery of power, or so it seemed. Thomas Greville and Lady Wren had no intention of allowing her to remain in the shadows. On a grey morning thick with fog, Greville sent a letter to Hardwicke Hall, its contents penned with delicate precision. He wrote of duty, of legacy, of the rightful claim that Arabella held to the throne of England. England is adrift, the letter read. Her people cry for guidance, for a ruler of English blood and English heart. Will you answer their call? The letter reached her hands under the careful watch of Bess of Hardwicke, her grandmother and guardian, a woman of formidable will and unyielding ambition. Lady Bess read the letter twice, her brow furrowing deeper with each pass. She knew Greville's reputation, his loyalty to Elizabeth, his distaste for the Scots now ruling from Whitehall. His proposal was madness, treason even, but it was also an opportunity. You must not respond, Bess whispered to Arabella, her voice sharp with warning. Greville is a dangerous man. If James finds out you have even entertained such thoughts, it will mean your head. Arabella held the letter in her hands, the parchment trembling slightly. Her eyes flickered with something Bess had not seen before, resolve. Elizabeth is gone, Arabella said softly, her voice steady. England is different now. I hear it in the letters, see it in the eyes of the servants who come from London. They are afraid. Is it treason to want to give them hope? Bessa's eyes narrowed. Hope, she repeated, almost scoffing. Hope is a dangerous thing. It builds kingdoms, but it also burns them to the ground. Arabella's gaze did not falter. Perhaps it is time to build something new, she replied. The silence between them was thick and heavy, filled with generations of ambition and restraint. Bess finally sighed, her shoulders sagging with the weight of possibility. If you walk this path, she said carefully, there is no turning back. You must understand that. Arabella folded the letter, pressing the seal back into place. I do, she answered. More than you know. In the depths of London, Greville received his response a week later. A simple card with a single line scrawled in careful ink, I will answer the call. His smile stretched wide, his hands clasping the note with reverence. He called for Lady Wren and Lord Pembroke, summoning them to his estate under the cover of night. When they arrived, Greville's eyes were alight with victory. He tossed the note onto the heavy oak table, its meaning clear as daylight. "The Queen in waiting," he announced, his voice reverberating off the stone walls. Lord Pembroke raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a half-smile. "The bloodline is pure," he admitted. "And the people, they will rally behind a true English queen. A name they know. A name they trust." Lady Wren leaned forward, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the tabletop. "But what of James?" she asked. "His spies are everywhere. He will not allow this rebellion to go unchecked. Arabella's life will be at risk the moment her intentions are known." Greville's expression did not waver. "Which is why we must move swiftly," he replied. "The northern lords are already with us. The common folk in London grow restless under James's rule. His council is fractured with distrust. We can strike hard and fast before he has a chance to solidify his power." Pembroke grunted in approval. "The time is ripe. I can raise 500 men in a fortnight. Many of the guard are loyal to Elizabeth's memory, they will turn when the moment comes." Lady Wren nodded, her eyes sharp and calculating. "And I can secure the city gates. My husband still commands the watch. He is persuadable." Greville's smile deepened. "Then it is settled. Arabella will be crowned at Westminster. We will give the people what they crave, a ruler of English blood, an heir of Elizabeth's legacy. And James will find himself cast out, an unwelcome foreigner in a land that is not his own." The firelight flickered, casting shadows against the walls, stretching their silhouettes long and dark. Outside, the rain pattered against the stone streets of London, a steady rhythm that echoed the beating of hearts now steeled for rebellion. Arabella, though isolated at Hardwicke, began her preparations. Letters were sent to distant relatives, to those who still held loyalty to the Tudor name. She practiced her speeches, her posture, her grace. Her handmaids whispered among themselves, their voices low with reverence, their eyes shining with the possibility of what was to come. Bess of Hardwicke watched with a gaze sharpened by experience. She knew the price of ambition, the cost of betrayal. Yet, she also knew that history did not favor the meek. If Arabella were to rise, it would be with fire and iron, not whispers and hesitation. And so the wheels of rebellion were set in motion, each cog turning with purpose and precision. Arabella's name began to circulate, first in hushed conversations, then in louder murmurs. The Queen in waiting, they called her, the heir of England's rightful legacy. James, though guarded by his Scottish entourage, began to feel the shift. His spies brought news of gatherings, of secret meetings, of arms being smuggled into the city. He doubled his guard, sent proclamations of unity through the kingdom, but the whispers persisted. The storm was coming, and its eye was fixed upon the throne of England. As spring began to thaw the frost from England's rolling hills, London became a city divided. Markets bustled with whispers, tavern corners flickered with candlelit conspiracies, and even the church pews were not immune to the murmurs of dissent. Greville's network of allies grew bolder, their plans expanding with each passing week. The northern lords, long wary of Scottish influence, pledged their allegiance to Arabella Stuart. Messengers rode through the night, carrying letters sealed with crests of loyalty and promises of men and arms. It was said that in Yorkshire alone, 2,000 men stood ready to march when the call came. Greville moved carefully, his meetings held in the cellars of merchant houses and behind the stone walls of decaying abbeys, far from the prying eyes of James's spies. Lady Wren, sharp and calculating, took charge of communication with the city's merchant guilds, whose fortunes had suffered under the new king's tariffs. Gold flowed into Greville's coffers, money to arm the rebels, to bribe the watchmen, to purchase silence where it was needed. Arabella, now fully aware of the weight of her decision, began her own preparations at Hardwicke Hall. Her grandmother, Bess of Hardwicke, arranged for private tutors, men who had once served in Elizabeth's court, scholars who knew the art of statecraft, military men who whispered of strategy and defense. Arabella learned to read maps with a general's eye, to understand the politics of alliance and the brutal necessity of swift action. "You must be more than a symbol," Bess would say, her voice unyielding. "You must be a queen in every sense of the word. Strong. Unyielding. A ruler who commands loyalty not out of fear, but respect." Arabella nodded, her eyes steely with determination. "I will not fail," she replied. "Not if it means reclaiming England for its people." In Whitehall, James grew increasingly paranoid. Reports of gatherings in the north, whispers of rebellion in London, and unsettling news from his own advisers began to fray his nerves. His council, composed mainly of Scottish nobles, urged him to take decisive action. These whispers must be silenced, Lord Balmerino, one of his most trusted confidants, urged during a late-night meeting. "If you let them grow, they will fester into open revolt." James paced before the grand hearth, his hands clasped behind his back. "I am not blind to the discontent," he replied, his voice low and sharp. "But to act too swiftly is to reveal our fear. We must be precise, surgical." Lord Balmerino raised an eyebrow. "What do you propose, Your Majesty?" James stopped his pacing, his eyes narrowing with resolution. "We root out the heads of this serpent," he said firmly. "Greville. Pembroke. Lady Wren. They are the architects of this treason. Cut them down, and the body will wither." Balmerino nodded, his expression grim. "I shall see to it," he replied. "Their homes will be watched. Their meetings, interrupted." James settled into his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing. "We will not let the memory of Elizabeth I poison the future of England," he murmured. "This is my kingdom now, and it shall remain so." But Greville was already a step ahead. His spies within Whitehall had grown bold, and news of James's plan reached him before the ink had dried on Balmerino's orders. That night, he summoned Lady Wren and Lord Pembroke to his estate in Clerkenwell, far from the prying eyes of the king's agents. Lady Wren arrived first, her cloak damp from the evening rain. She swept into the candlelit study, shaking droplets from her hood and unfastening her gloves with swift efficiency. "I hear the king has grown restless," she remarked, her eyes sharp with calculation. Greville smiled, pouring a glass of dark red wine and handing it to her. "He fears the ghosts of Elizabeth," he replied, chuckling. "He thinks to silence us before we can draw blood. But he underestimates our resolve." Lord Pembroke entered moments later, his boots heavy with mud, his expression severe. "James has doubled his guard at Whitehall," he announced without preamble. "I counted nearly twice the number on my way here. He prepares for war, even if he does not yet declare it." Greville set his glass down, the smile fading from his lips. Then we must act before he does, he said, his voice steady. He leaned forward, his hands splayed across the heavy oak table. The North is ready. Arabella is prepared. We move within the month. Lady Wren raised an eyebrow. Open revolt? Greville met her gaze without hesitation. It is the only way. If we wait, James will strangle us in our beds. We strike first, and we strike hard. London will rise with us, and Arabella will sit upon the throne as she was meant to. Lord Pembroke considered this, his eyes narrowing. And what of James? Greville's smile returned, colder this time. He will be given a choice, return to Scotland, or face the blade. A silence settled over the room, the weight of treason heavy in the air. Finally, Lady Wren raised her glass, her eyes glittering with determination. To England, she toasted. To her rightful queen. Greville and Pembroke joined her, their glasses clinking together, the sound sharp and resolute. To England, they echoed. And to the storm that comes. The wheels were set in motion. The North began to gather its strength, supplies were smuggled into London under the guise of merchant goods, and the docks grew thick with whispers of rebellion. Arabella's name spread like wildfire, carried by the tongues of discontented merchants and the ink of secret pamphlets. For James, the walls of Whitehall grew tighter, the shadows longer. His paranoia deepened, and his grip upon the throne, once so assured, now seemed fragile, shaken by the whispers of a queen in waiting. The storm was coming, and it would not be long before the thunder of rebellion echoed through the streets of London. The spring of 1603 dawned with a sense of unease. Clouds hung low over the Thames, casting long shadows over the stone battlements of Whitehall Palace. Within the walls, James's court moved with a tension that was palpable, whispers flitting between courtiers like sparks among dry leaves. The king himself had grown reclusive, his council sessions held behind bolted doors, his most trusted advisers sworn to secrecy. Despite his public assurances of stability, James's private correspondence painted a different picture, letters filled with paranoia and suspicion, demanding more spies, more soldiers, more control. Meanwhile, Greville's network thrived in the dark alleys and tavern cellars of London. The cobbled streets buzzed with news of the North's readiness, of Arabella's growing strength at Hardwicke Hall, and of Greville's quiet determination to see her seated upon the throne. Weapons were smuggled under the guise of merchant goods, hidden in crates marked with the sigils of trusted guilds. Powder and shot flowed through secret channels, stockpiled in hidden cellars beneath the city. Greville's men worked tirelessly, forging alliances with discontented merchants and silenced nobles who saw in Arabella the spirit of Elizabeth reborn. Lady Wren, ever resourceful, established lines of communication with those in Whitehall who sympathized with their cause. Servants, scullery maids, and guards were bribed with silver and promises of a better England. Messages were passed in loaves of bread, sealed with wax, and delivered with the morning milk. On a cool April evening, as the moon cast its pale light over the city, Greville gathered his closest allies at a secluded estate on the outskirts of London. The room was dimly lit, shadows flickering across the faces of those who had pledged their lives to the cause. Greville stood at the head of the table, his hands splayed across a map of London and its surrounding counties. "The time has come," he announced, his voice steady and resolute. "James grows more paranoid by the day. His spies circle like wolves, but they are blind to our true strength. Lord Pembroke leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Greville. "And Arabella?" he asked. Greville's eyes sparkled with confidence. "She is ready. Her forces gather in the north as we speak. When the bells of St. Paul's toll at midnight 3 days hence, we march. London will rise with us." A murmur spread through the room, hushed yet electric. Lady Wren, seated beside the hearth, raised her glass in a silent toast. "To England," she whispered. The others followed suit, their glasses raised high. "To England," they echoed, their voices low but filled with conviction. The 3 days that followed were tense with anticipation. Across the city, Greville's men moved in shadows, passing final messages, sharpening blades, and securing safe houses. Lady Wren oversaw the distribution of arms, her network of messengers slipping through the fog-choked streets under the cover of darkness. The docks, always a hub of whispers and trade, bustled with unusual activity. Crates marked with foreign sigils were unloaded with care, their contents hidden beneath layers of straw and tarpaulin. Muskets, swords, and barrels of powder vanished into the winding alleys of Eastcheap and Southwark, tucked away in hidden caches. In the north, Arabella prepared with equal determination. Her grandmother, Bess of Hardwicke, had secured the loyalty of the northern lords, promising fairer rule and a return to Elizabethan strength. Men trained in the shadow of old keeps, their breath visible in the crisp dawn air as they drilled with pikes and swords. Arabella herself walked among them, dressed not in the silks and lace of nobility but in the sturdy garb of a commander. She spoke to them as Elizabeth had spoken to her troops at Tilbury, her voice carrying across the fields with the strength of conviction. "We fight not just for the throne," she declared, her eyes alight with fire, "but for the soul of England. For the memory of Elizabeth and the promise of a better future." The soldiers roared in approval, their fists raised to the sky. Arabella watched them, her heart swelling with pride and purpose. "For England," she cried. "For England," they shouted back, their voices a wave of defiance that rolled across the northern hills. At Whitehall, James grew restless. Reports of gatherings in Yorkshire reached his ears, tales of armed men and pledges of loyalty to a different sovereign. He summoned his council, his face pale and drawn. "They plot against me," he hissed, his hands trembling as he slammed a fist upon the oak table. "They would see me dethroned, replaced." His advisers, wary and cautious, exchanged glances. "We must act, Your Majesty," Lord Balmerino urged. "Root them out before their numbers grow." James nodded, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Send word to the northern garrisons. Have them arrest anyone suspected of disloyalty. Seal the city gates. No one enters or leaves without my command." The orders were dispatched with haste, riders galloping into the night, their cloaks billowing like dark wings as they vanished into the fog. But Greville had anticipated the move. As James's men marched north, Greville's spies shadowed them, dispatching word to Arabella's camp before the king's forces could even cross the Trent. By the time they arrived in Yorkshire, the rebel forces had vanished, slipping into the mist-laden forests and hidden valleys known only to the locals. James's soldiers found only empty fields and watchful eyes, the villagers tight-lipped and unyielding. The first skirmishes broke out near Wakefield, a clash of steel and musket fire that left the field stained with the blood of both loyalist and rebel. Greville, receiving word of the battle, nodded grimly. "The die is cast," he murmured to Lady Wren, who stood at his side. She met his gaze with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Now, we see who holds the heart of England," she replied. The city braced itself. The fires of rebellion had been lit, and the winds of change howled through the narrow streets and high towers. The whispers of rebellion soon grew louder, echoing through the corridors of Whitehall and slipping into the ears of the court like venom. James paced the length of his chamber, his boots scuffing against the polished wood as shadows flickered in the candlelight. His brow was furrowed with tension, his fingers clenched tightly around a roll of parchment bearing the royal seal. Lord Balmerino stood at attention near the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He had been the bearer of grim news. The skirmishes in the north had not only failed to suppress the uprising but had seemingly bolstered its ranks. Arabella's supporters now numbered in the hundreds, and rumors of secret sympathizers in London itself had begun to spread. "They plot in shadows," James muttered, his voice low and taut with strain. "They gather in secret, thinking I am blind to their schemes." He paused, turning sharply to face Balmerino. "I want them found. I want Greville, Arabella, and every traitor who whispers her name dragged before me in chains." Balmerino hesitated, his eyes darting to the window where the sun dipped low over the city skyline. "Your Majesty," he began cautiously, "Greville's network runs deep. He has eyes in the guilds, in the markets, even in the palace, I fear. If we are to uproot this treason, we must be thorough." James's gaze hardened. "Do what you must," he replied, his voice cold and unyielding. "No stone unturned. No hand left unsearched. If they seek to strike at me, then I shall strike first." The crackdown was swift and merciless. Throughout the city, soldiers marched through market squares and cobbled alleys, their swords gleaming beneath the pale light of dawn. Taverns were raided, homes were searched, and men were dragged from their beds, accused of treason on little more than a whisper or a glance. In the shadowed corners of London's underbelly, Greville's agents watched with keen eyes, slipping through the cracks where the king's men could not follow. Lady Wren, ever elusive, moved like a shadow through the streets, her footsteps silent against the cobbles as she relayed messages from one hideout to the next. "James grows desperate," she whispered to Greville one evening as they met beneath the arched beams of a deserted wine cellar. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and stale casks. Greville, leaning over a wooden table scattered with maps and sealed letters, looked up, his expression grim but resolute. "Desperation breeds mistakes," he replied, his voice barely above a murmur. "We need only wait for his hand to falter." Lady Wren raised an eyebrow. "And if it does not?" Greville smiled, a flicker of firelight dancing in his eyes. "Then we give it a push." The first act of defiance came on the eve of May Day. Under the cover of darkness, Greville's men moved through the city, scaling the walls of Whitehall's outer gardens and slipping past the guards with practiced ease. They worked swiftly, uncoiling banners of crimson and gold and draping them over the palace gates. When dawn broke over the city, the banners flapped defiantly in the wind, embroidered with the emblem of Elizabeth's reign, a Tudor rose, entwined with a laurel of victory. James, upon seeing them from his chambers, flew into a rage. "Treason!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the stone halls. "They mock me upon my very doorstep." The banners were torn down, but the damage was done. Word spread through London's markets and docks, whispers of rebellion growing louder with each passing day. The Queen's bloodline lives, they murmured. Elizabeth's spirit has returned. Meanwhile, in the north, Arabella gathered her forces. Hardwicke Hall had transformed from a stately manor into a stronghold. The gates were fortified, the walls lined with archers, and the great halls filled with soldiers loyal to her cause. She held court in the main hall, where banners of crimson and white adorned the walls, flanked by tapestries bearing the Tudor rose. The northern lords, men who had once pledged their loyalty to Elizabeth, now stood at her side. They spoke of strategy, of alliances yet to be secured, and of the whispers filtering down from London. Arabella listened intently, her eyes bright with determination. "We must be ready," she told them. "James will not sit idle. He will come for us, and when he does, we must be stronger, swifter, and unyielding." Sir William Cavendish, a stout man with a thick beard and eyes like steel, nodded his approval. "The people favor you, Lady Arabella. They see in you the spirit of your grandmother, Bess, and the fire of Queen Elizabeth." Arabella smiled, though there was a flicker of sadness behind her gaze. "It is not only my blood they follow," she replied. "It is the promise of something better. An England that does not bow to fear and tyranny." The hall erupted in applause, the sound reverberating off the stone walls like thunder. Arabella stood before them, her chin raised high, the torchlight casting her shadow long and regal. For the first time since the whispers of rebellion began, she felt the full weight of her legacy, not as a burden but as a crown. Back in London, the crackdown continued. James's men grew more desperate, their searches more aggressive. Those suspected of treason were dragged before the courts, their confessions extracted through fear and force. But the names they whispered were never enough. Greville remained hidden, Lady Wren an elusive ghost slipping through their grasp. Late one night, as rain poured in heavy sheets against the palace windows, James sat alone in his chamber, a goblet of wine clutched in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot, his fingers drumming against the wooden arm of his chair. Outside, the storm raged, but within, a darker tempest brewed. "They will come for me," he whispered to the flickering candlelight, his breath fogging the air before him. "They plot in shadows, but I will bring them to light." He drained his goblet and slammed it down upon the table, the sound echoing through the empty room. In his eyes, the reflection of the fire flickered like the fires of war, unforgiving, unyielding, and inevitable. The storm that lashed London in the spring of 1603 seemed almost prophetic. Rain fell in torrents, flooding the cobbled streets and washing away the grime of winter. But for those loyal to Greville and Arabella, the downpour was nothing more than a curtain of opportunity. Beneath the shroud of night, shadowed figures moved through the city, slipping past watchmen and slipping messages into the hands of allies. Lady Wren, ever the phantom, coordinated with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. She darted through narrow alleyways, her cloak flaring behind her like the wings of a raven. Messages were passed, letters exchanged, and symbols scratched into hidden corners, marks that only those loyal to the cause would recognize. By dawn, the storm had cleared, leaving behind slick streets and a chill in the air that cut to the bone. But the banners of rebellion were visible once again. This time, they were draped not just over the gates of Whitehall but in marketplaces and churchyards. The crimson Tudor rose fluttered defiantly in the breeze, a symbol that London was not as tightly bound to James's rule as he had believed. The king's response was swift and unyielding. Soldiers flooded the streets, tearing down banners and searching homes without warning. Those suspected of disloyalty were dragged from their beds, hauled before hastily constructed tribunals where guilt was often assumed, and innocence nearly impossible to prove. In the shadowed recesses of Greville's hidden chambers, plans were laid with a precision that belied the chaos outside. Maps of the city were spread across oaken tables, marked with charcoal lines that indicated patrol routes, supply depots, and, most crucially, the vulnerabilities of Whitehall itself. "It must be quick," Greville whispered, his finger tracing the path from the outskirts of the city to the palace gates. A strike like the crack of thunder, decisive, unstoppable. Lady Wren nodded, her gaze fixed intently on the plans. "We have the numbers," she replied. "And the people grow restless. Each of James's raids only serves to harden their hearts against him." Greville leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "And what of Arabella?" Lady Wren smiled faintly. "Her forces gather strength in the north. When the time comes, she will be ready." Greville allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "Then it seems the storm is only just beginning." The streets of London, once bustling with trade and chatter, now thrummed with tension. Markets were sparse, merchants glanced over their shoulders, and the ever-watchful eyes of the king's soldiers lingered at every corner. But even in the presence of steel and suspicion, whispers grew. "Elizabeth's blood lives on," they murmured in taverns and churchyards. "Arabella will come. The throne will be restored." James, ever wary of disloyalty, tightened his grip on the city. His Scottish advisers patrolled the halls of Whitehall, their accents cutting through the air like knives. Even his closest ministers found themselves subject to scrutiny. Loyalty was no longer assumed, it had to be proven, often with blood. It was during one of these purges that Thomas Grey, a minor lord with known sympathies for Greville, was seized from his estate. His household was ransacked, his servants scattered, and he was brought before the Privy Council to answer for crimes of sedition. Grey, bound and bloodied, stood defiantly before his captors. "You think you can hold back the tide?" he spat, his voice cracking but resolute. "You think you can kill whispers with swords? There are more of us than you know." His execution was swift, a grim display in the center of London Square. But rather than silence the whispers, it only fed the flames. News traveled fast to the north, carried by riders who braved the winding roads and watchful eyes of James's patrols. When Arabella received the letter bearing word of Thomas Grey's fate, she read it in silence, her hands steady, her expression unmoved. Sir William Cavendish watched her carefully, his fingers tapping against the hilt of his sword. "They make martyrs of our friends," he remarked. "It only strengthens our cause." Arabella looked up from the parchment, her eyes steely and unyielding. "Indeed," she replied. "James may rule London for now, but the north is ours. And soon, so too shall be the rest." There was a murmur of agreement from the gathered lords and knights. In that moment, the lines of loyalty were drawn with ink and iron. Arabella was no longer just a claimant, she was their queen in waiting. Back in London, Greville received word of Arabella's declaration with grim satisfaction. He stood at the window of his shadowed quarters, watching as the city writhed under the grip of James's soldiers. "It begins," he whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "The tide turns at last." Lady Wren appeared at his shoulder, her gaze fixed upon the narrow alleyways below. Word spreads faster than fire, she murmured. The people are ready. Greville turned to her, his expression resolute. Then it's time to give them something to believe in. The strike was planned for dawn. Under the cover of twilight, Greville's men moved through the streets, spreading whispers and fanning the flames of rebellion. Armed with swords and conviction, they prepared to challenge the crown itself. As the first light of day crept over the city, the bells of St. Paul's tolled, their iron clang echoing through the streets like a clarion call. Greville stepped from the shadows, his cloak billowing behind him, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He raised his voice to the throng that gathered around him, their faces alight with anticipation. Today, he called out, his voice carrying above the noise, we take back what is ours. For Elizabeth, for Arabella, for England. A cheer erupted, rolling through the streets like thunder. The rebellion had begun, and the city of London trembled under its weight. The rebellion ignited with a ferocity that none in Whitehall had anticipated. Greville's forces surged through the narrow streets of London, their banners flaring crimson against the morning fog. The symbol of the Tudor rose was painted on walls and fluttered from hastily erected flagpoles. Men and women alike joined the march, their faces set with determination, their voices rising in chants that echoed through the city. Long live Arabella! Long live the true Queen! Greville, at the head of the charge, moved with a confidence that bordered on regal. His cloak billowed behind him as he led the crowd through Cheapside, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his sword. By his side, Lady Wren flitted like a shadow, whispering instructions to lieutenants and dispatching messages with a flick of her wrist. They moved swiftly, targeting key outposts manned by James's guards. The first to fall was the watchtower at Aldgate, its garrison overtaken with little resistance. Greville's men slipped in through the side alleys, cutting off escape routes and dismantling the alarms before the guards even had time to draw their swords. The next was the armory at Bishopsgate. Here, the resistance was stronger. James's soldiers fought with the desperation of men cornered. Steel clashed against steel, the air thick with the tang of iron and the shouts of battle. Greville moved through the chaos with grim efficiency, his blade cutting through defenses as if they were paper. Word reached Whitehall by midday. James paced the floor of his council chamber, his face flushed with anger, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Around him, Scottish advisers murmured in anxious tones, their eyes darting towards the door as if expecting Greville's men to burst through at any moment. How many? James barked, turning his gaze to Sir Francis Walden, who stood rigid by the window. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, Walden replied, his voice steady but strained. They move through the city with purpose. We believe Greville is leading them. James's expression darkened. Greville. He whispered, almost to himself. I should have had him executed long ago. Indeed, Walden replied cautiously. But there is still time to act. We must secure Whitehall, Your Majesty. If they reach the palace. They won't, James interrupted, his voice sharp. Send word to the garrison. I want every entrance sealed, every soldier ready. Greville may think he's a lion, but I will show him that I am the hunter. Meanwhile, the rebellion pressed forward. Greville's forces swelled with each passing hour, commoners joining the march as it passed through the marketplaces and alleyways. Lady Wren moved among them, her whispers like threads that bound the rebellion together. In a hidden alcove near St. Martin's, she found herself face to face with a group of seamstresses who had abandoned their work to join the cause. One of them, a wiry woman with silver threading her hair, stepped forward. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope. "Does Arabella march from the north?" Lady Wren met her gaze steadily. "She does," she replied. "And she carries Elizabeth's blood. With her, the true crown shall be restored." The woman nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "Then we are with you," she said, her voice resolute. "To the end." The rebellion's momentum grew with each victory. By nightfall, Greville's forces had seized control of the northern gates of the city. Barricades were erected, and watchmen loyal to James were either imprisoned or forced to flee. The streets belonged to the rebellion now, and Greville wasted no time consolidating his power. He stood atop the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral, his voice carrying out across the square as torches flickered in the twilight. "People of London," he called, his voice thunderous. "Today, we reclaim our city from the hands of tyranny. Today, we restore the blood of Elizabeth to its rightful place. Stand with me, and together we shall see England rise once more." A roar of approval surged through the crowd. Swords were raised, fists clenched, and voices shouted their loyalty to the Tudor cause. Lady Wren watched from the shadows, her eyes sharp and unblinking. "They are ready," she murmured to herself, a thin smile tracing her lips. "All that remains is the final strike." At Whitehall, James prepared for the siege. His forces were marshaled with brutal efficiency, walls were reinforced, and spies were sent out under the cover of darkness to gather information on Greville's movements. But even within the palace walls, there were whispers, soft, almost imperceptible murmurs of discontent. "Arabella is the true heir," they whispered in the servants' quarters and in the dimly lit halls. "Elizabeth's blood runs through her veins. She will bring back the Golden Age." James knew of these whispers, and they burned at him. He doubled his efforts, stamping out dissent with ruthless precision, but the whispers only grew. By the light of the moon, Greville and Lady Wren pored over maps of Whitehall, tracing the paths of guards, marking the entrances least fortified. The plan was set: at dawn, they would strike. "Are you ready?" Lady Wren asked, her eyes glinting with anticipation. Greville looked up from the map, his expression resolute. "Ready as I'll ever be." They clasped hands, a silent pact forged in the fires of rebellion. "Then tomorrow," she whispered, "we take Whitehall." Dawn broke over London with a harsh, pale light. Fog clung to the cobblestones, curling around the legs of Greville's forces as they gathered in the shadow of St. Paul's. The church bells told a solemn rhythm, their echoes rolling through the city like distant thunder. Greville stood at the head of the throng, his cloak billowing behind him, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Beside him, Lady Wren moved like a wraith, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "This is the day," Greville called out, his voice cutting through the chill morning air. "This is the day we reclaim England's soul." A cheer rose up, fierce and unrelenting, reverberating through the narrow streets. Banners unfurled, the crimson Tudor rose flaring defiantly in the mist. Greville raised his sword high, its blade glinting in the sunlight that broke through the fog. "For Arabella. For England." The roar of approval was deafening. With a sharp gesture, Greville turned, leading the charge down Cheapside and towards the fortified gates of Whitehall. Soldiers clad in crimson and steel marched beside him, their faces hard with determination. Inside Whitehall, James was already prepared. The king stood in his private chambers, watching the fog lift from the city with eyes sharp and calculating. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his breath misted in the chill air. Behind him, Sir Francis Walden stood stiffly, his expression unreadable. "They come," Walden murmured, nodding towards the window where the distant shapes of Greville's forces began to coalesce. James's jaw tightened. "Let them," he replied, his voice hard and unyielding. "This palace has stood against greater men than Thomas Greville." Outside, soldiers were stationed at every gate, their armor polished, their pikes glinting in the sunlight. Barricades had been erected along the main thoroughfares, and archers lined the battlements, their bows drawn, their eyes sharp. Whitehall was a fortress, and James had every intention of holding it. Greville's forces reached the main gates by midday. The streets behind them thrummed with energy, merchants and commoners alike lining the avenues, their faces alight with hope and fear in equal measure. Greville raised his hand, signaling a halt, and the army stilled, the clattering of armor and murmurs of anticipation fading into silence. Lady Wren stepped forward, her voice ringing out over the courtyard. "We come not as conquerors," she called, her voice smooth and steady. "We come to restore what was taken, to see the rightful bloodline return to the throne of England." Her words were met with scattered cheers, fists raised in solidarity. From atop the battlements, a captain of James's guard stepped forward, his face shadowed beneath his helmet. "You come to die, rebels," he shouted, his voice edged with derision. "Return to your hovels, lest you wish to hang beside your traitorous lords." Greville stepped forward, his expression hardening. "We will not leave," he called back, his voice booming through the square. "Not until Arabella is crowned, and the blood of Elizabeth flows through Whitehall once more." The captain sneered. "Then you shall meet the same fate as every traitor before you." He raised his hand, and the archers on the battlements drew their bows taut. Greville did not flinch. His gaze locked with Lady Wren's, and she nodded, slipping back into the crowd with a grace that seemed almost ethereal. Moments later, the first arrow flew. It sliced through the air, burying itself in the cobblestones mere inches from Greville's feet. He did not move, nor did his men. A silence hung heavy over the square, tense and unyielding. Then Greville raised his hand. "Forward!" With a roar, the army surged forward, shields raised, swords drawn. The archers unleashed a flurry of arrows, the sky darkening with their flight. Men fell, cries of pain mingling with the clash of steel as Greville's forces crashed against the gates of Whitehall. The first line of defense crumbled beneath the weight of Greville's charge. Lady Wren's spies had done their work well, the guard was undermanned, their ranks thinned by strategic misinformation and well-timed diversions. Greville pressed the advantage, his sword flashing as he cut through the defenders, his movements swift and precise. "Hold the line," a voice shouted from within the walls, but the command was lost in the chaos. Greville's men poured through the breach, scattering the defenders like leaves in a storm. Lady Wren appeared at Greville's side, her daggers slick with blood, her eyes alight with triumph. "To the throne room," she urged, her voice low but firm. "End this now." Greville nodded, gesturing to his captains. "Secure the courtyard," he commanded. "No one enters, no one leaves. Lady Wren and I will see this done." The soldiers saluted, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Greville turned to Lady Wren, his expression resolute. "Are you ready?" Her smile was sharp and unyielding. "I was born ready." Together, they pushed through the grand halls of Whitehall, their footsteps echoing through the stone corridors. Resistance was light. Most of James's guards had been drawn to the courtyard, leaving the inner sanctum vulnerable. Greville moved with the confidence of a conqueror, his hand steady on the hilt of his sword. As they reached the doors of the throne room, Lady Wren placed a hand on his arm, her gaze piercing. "This is it," she whispered. "End it here, and England is yours." Greville nodded, his jaw set. With a swift motion, he pushed the doors open, the grand hall beyond stretching out before them, empty save for the gilded throne at its center. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, the weight of history pressing down upon them. Then, Greville stepped forward, his footsteps echoing through the hall. Lady Wren moved beside him, her eyes scanning the shadows, her daggers at the ready. The throne stood before them, draped in crimson and gold, its surface polished to a gleaming shine. Greville paused, his hand resting on the armrest, his expression unyielding. "This is just the beginning," Lady Wren murmured, her voice a whisper in the vast emptiness. Greville nodded, his gaze fixed on the seat of power. "Yes," he replied, his voice resolute. "The beginning of a new era." The days following Essex's execution brought a silence to the court that was palpable. Elizabeth, once fierce and unyielding, now seemed a shadow of her former self. Those closest to her noticed the change, her sharp wit dulled, her appetite faded, and the fire in her eyes dimmed. Ministers and courtiers murmured behind closed doors, whispering that the Queen had not only lost a trusted adviser but a piece of her spirit. Her nights grew longer and more restless, punctuated by sleepless hours staring into the flickering light of the hearth. Richmond Palace, where she now spent most of her time, felt cloaked in an invisible shroud. Her ladies-in-waiting moved quietly, their footsteps softened by thick carpets, their whispers hushed to mere breaths. The Queen, once surrounded by musicians and poets, now preferred silence. Music, which once filled the grand halls with life and celebration, was now considered an intrusion upon her solitude. Physicians came and went, offering tonics and remedies, though none dared mention what many suspected: Elizabeth was slipping away. The Queen, proud and defiant even in the face of mortality, waved them off with a flick of her wrist. She refused their medicines, rejected their suggestions for rest, and ignored their pleas to eat more than a few bites of bread and sips of watered wine. It was as if she had resolved herself to this fate, a fate she had long denied could ever touch her. Outside the palace walls, the kingdom stirred with whispers of uncertainty. James VI of Scotland, the son of her executed cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, was the presumed heir. His Protestant faith and Tudor bloodline positioned him as the logical successor, yet Elizabeth had refused to name him formally. Her reluctance was rooted in more than just politics, it was personal. Naming James as her heir would mean acknowledging the end of her line, the conclusion of the Tudor dynasty she had fought so fiercely to preserve. It would mean admitting that her rule, her legacy, would be handed to the son of the woman she had sent to the scaffold. In the early days of March 1603, Elizabeth's condition worsened. Her refusal to sleep became almost legendary among her attendants. She would stand for hours at a time, leaning against cushions or gripping the back of a chair for support. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, now seemed distant and clouded with unspoken grief. When urged to rest, she would shake her head, murmuring that if she lay down, she might never rise again. Her mind, still sharp in its moments of clarity, clung stubbornly to the belief that to sleep was to surrender. Her ladies-in-waiting, faithful and silent, tried to coax her into bed, offering warm milk laced with honey, herbal concoctions meant to soothe the body and mind. But Elizabeth remained resolute. She took to standing in the middle of her chamber, eyes fixed upon the flickering light of the fire, lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps, in whispered conversations with ghosts of her past. By mid-March, word of the Queen's decline spread through the court, and with it, uncertainty blossomed. Nobles gathered in shadowed corridors, exchanging glances and hushed conversations. Who would ascend to the throne? Would James be accepted without conflict, or would the kingdom descend into chaos? The absence of an heir was a festering wound, and Elizabeth's silence on the matter only deepened the divide among her advisers. The Earl of Nottingham, one of her most trusted ministers, urged her gently to make her wishes known. "Your Majesty," he whispered one evening as the firelight danced upon the walls, "the kingdom must know your will. England must be prepared." Elizabeth regarded him with a weary gaze, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. For a moment, it seemed she might speak, that she might finally unburden herself of the decision that hung heavy over the realm. But then she turned away, her silence as sharp and deliberate as any command she had given in her reign. The weight of the crown, though invisible, pressed down upon her shoulders with a force that seemed almost tangible. Those who served her saw it in the way she moved, slower and more deliberate, as if each step was an act of will. Her dresses, once vibrant and adorned with jewels, now seemed to hang off her frame, a shell of splendor that masked the frailty beneath. Through the windows of Richmond Palace, the trees began to bud, the first signs of spring pushing through the frost-laden soil. But within those stone walls, the chill of winter remained, clinging to Elizabeth like a shadow that would not be cast off. Her chamber grew darker with each passing day, heavy curtains drawn against the pale sunlight that she once basked in. Those who visited her spoke of her gaze, how it lingered on the portraits of those long gone, her father, Henry VIII, her mother, and Boleyn, whose ghost she seemed to address in whispers. Servants claimed to hear her voice drifting through the corridors late at night, carrying the weight of memories too heavy to bear alone. The kingdom waited, breath held in collective anticipation. They waited for a name, for a word from their monarch that would secure the line of succession and bring stability to a nation on the edge of change. But Elizabeth remained silent, her voice locked away with secrets only she would carry to the grave. As March wore on, the air within Richmond Palace grew heavier with anticipation and unspoken dread. Courtiers gathered in tight circles, whispering their speculations in hushed voices. Ministers exchanged glances of uncertainty, their eyes darting towards the closed doors of the Queen's private chambers. Elizabeth had not been seen in days, and the rumors of her health grew darker with each passing hour. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting moved silently through the corridors, their faces pale with concern. Lady Scrope, one of Elizabeth's most trusted attendants, had taken to sitting outside the Queen's chamber door, listening for any sign of movement within. But the silence was thick and unyielding, broken only by the occasional murmur of prayer or the rustle of heavy skirts brushing against the stone floors. Inside her chamber, Elizabeth sat upright, refusing the comfort of her bed. She wore a heavy silk gown, its emerald fabric catching the dim light of the flickering candles. Her hair, still arranged in the familiar curls beneath her auburn wig, framed a face that seemed almost spectral in the half-light. Her eyes, though weary, held a sharpness that defied the fragility of her body. Physicians hovered nearby, their faces drawn with anxiety. They whispered among themselves, debating the nature of her decline. Some claimed it was melancholy that had sapped her strength, the grief of losing so many she had loved, combined with the weight of a throne she had held for nearly half a century. Others suggested it was the poison of age, creeping into her bones, robbing her of the vitality that had once defined her. Dr. John D., her former advisor and confidant, had been called upon to consult, though his presence had stirred unease among the more superstitious members of the court. His reputation as a scholar of the occult was well known, and though Elizabeth had long valued his counsel, his return to court at such a dire hour led to whispers of dark arts and forbidden knowledge. D., however, had merely taken her hand, whispered words of comfort, and left as silently as he had arrived. Elizabeth's refusal to rest became a matter of grave concern. She would not lie down, would not allow herself the respite of sleep. Her ladies brought cushions and draped blankets over her frail frame, but she brushed them away. "If I rest, I may never rise," she whispered once to Lady Scrope, her eyes glazed with fatigue yet filled with unyielding determination. Her voice was soft, fragile like the first crack of ice on a winter's pond, but her will remained iron. Outside, the kingdom braced itself. Church bells tolled in Westminster, and nobles prepared for the inevitable transition of power. James VI of Scotland had been informed of the Queen's failing health, and preparations for his journey south were underway. His advisers urged caution, knowing that the English court was a web of alliances and rivalries that could easily fracture in the absence of clear leadership. Meanwhile, within Richmond, Elizabeth's ministers urged her to make a final proclamation, to name James officially as her successor and dispel any shadow of doubt. But she remained silent on the matter, her stubbornness a testament to the iron resolve that had carried her through wars, rebellions, and political intrigue. Naming James meant surrendering the last of her power, and Elizabeth had never been one to surrender. On the evening of March 22, a storm swept through London. Thunder rolled across the Thames, and rain battered the windows of the palace. Elizabeth, still refusing to sleep, sat in her chair by the fire, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Her ladies, weary and anxious, hovered nearby, whispering prayers for her strength and for her soul. Suddenly, Elizabeth spoke, her voice startlingly clear against the crackling of the fire. "I am not afraid to die," she whispered, her gaze unflinching as she stared into the heart of the flames. Her ladies exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. But Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I have done what I was meant to do. England is strong, and she will remain so." There was a pause, and in the silence, the storm outside raged on. "But I will not rest. Not yet." The following morning, as dawn crept through the gray skies, Elizabeth's condition took a turn. Her breathing grew shallow, and her eyes, once sharp and unyielding, now seemed distant and unfocused. Physicians were called, prayers were whispered, and ministers stood by, waiting for a word, a gesture, anything that might signal her wishes. Elizabeth, ever defiant, held on. She refused the offers of a soft bed, choosing instead to remain seated, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. It was as if she were holding court one final time, her spirit unwilling to bend even in the face of death. The kingdom, sensing the end was near, fell into mourning. Black cloth draped over market stalls, and merchants whispered prayers as they went about their business. Priests led congregations in solemn hymns, and the streets of London seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the news that would change the course of history. As the rebellion simmered and the court held its breath, James I found himself entangled in the delicate web of power and mistrust. His Scottish advisers, whom he relied upon heavily, began to face growing hostility from the English nobility. Whispers of conspiracy drifted through the grand halls of Whitehall, and tensions simmered just beneath the surface. James, sensing the cracks in his newfound kingdom, sought to solidify his rule with grand gestures and sweeping policies. But his decisions only deepened the divide. In the shadowed corridors of power, Thomas Greville and his allies plotted with renewed vigor. Their resolve had not wavered, instead, it had grown stronger with each misstep of the king. Greville, a man of relentless ambition, saw the cracks forming in James's court and seized upon them. He sent word to former Elizabethan loyalists, calling for unity against the foreign influence that now pervaded England's throne. Letters, sealed with wax and marked with coded insignias, traveled by night to safe houses and secret gatherings. The network expanded. Nobles who had once feigned loyalty to James now pledged themselves to Greville's cause. Secret meetings were held in dimly lit parlors and wine cellars beneath London's bustling streets. There, plans were forged, alliances cemented, and strategies mapped out. Greville spoke with a conviction that drew others to his side, his voice promising not just rebellion, but restoration of Elizabeth's legacy and the purging of Scottish influence from the English court. Yet, James was no fool. His advisers, sensing the mounting unrest, tightened their grip on London. Spies were dispatched to the very taverns and halls where Greville's supporters gathered. Men vanished in the night, whispers of treason carried on the wind, and trust became a rare and precious commodity. To speak out against the king, even in confidence, was to gamble with one's life. Still, Greville pressed on. He knew that to hesitate would be to lose momentum. He arranged a secret council in the heart of London, a gathering of noble families, former counselors of Elizabeth, and merchants who had thrived under her reign. They came cloaked and hooded, slipping through the fog-shrouded streets under cover of darkness. Greville stood before them, his eyes alight with determination. "We are not just fighting for a throne," he declared, his voice carrying through the stone hall. "We are fighting for England's soul. For the legacy of Elizabeth, who ruled with wisdom and strength. We cannot allow this kingdom to be stripped of its pride and sovereignty by those who do not understand its heart." The crowd murmured in agreement, nodding as Greville continued. "We shall act swiftly and decisively. Whitehall will fall, and with it, the chains of foreign rule. For England, for Elizabeth, and for our future." His fist slammed against the wooden podium, the sound echoing through the chamber. The rebellion, now with purpose and unity, began its final preparations. Swords were sharpened, armor polished, and plans whispered among trusted allies. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first crack of thunder that would signal the storm. But James was prepared. His own networks of spies had uncovered pieces of Greville's plan. He fortified Whitehall, called upon his loyal guards, and stationed watchmen at every gate. The king, for all his flaws, would not yield his throne without a fight. The streets of London grew tense, shadows lengthening as dusk fell. Fires flickered in alleyways, and the sound of marching boots echoed off cobblestone paths. War was coming, not from distant shores, but from within the very heart of England. The city of London stirred with unease. Word of Greville's secret council spread in whispers from the shadowy corners of taverns to the polished floors of noble estates. Men of influence weighed their loyalties carefully. Some clung to the promise of James's unification, while others longed for the return of Elizabethan order and the familiar strength of English sovereignty. Inside Whitehall, James I convened his most trusted advisers. The dim light of the chamber cast long shadows over the faces of men burdened with fear and ambition. Maps were unfurled, names listed, and plans whispered. Sir Francis Walden, his closest adviser, spoke with the clipped precision of a military strategist. "The rebellion is not just a whisper, it is a roar, my lord. Greville gathers strength by the day. We must act decisively." James nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We shall cut off the head of the snake before it strikes. I will not be usurped by the ghosts of a dead queen," he declared, his voice sharp with resolve. He ordered spies to infiltrate Greville's ranks, to uncover their hidden supporters, and to strike before their plans could come to fruition. Greville, meanwhile, moved with the urgency of a man who felt the weight of destiny upon his shoulders. He dispatched messages to his allies, urging them to stand ready. In hidden cellars, blacksmiths hammered swords and spears. Supplies were gathered, and routes to Whitehall were mapped with precision. It would not be a slow siege, it would be a swift, calculated strike. He believed that one sharp blow would topple James's fragile grasp on the throne. But James's web of informants stretched deep into Greville's circle. At dawn, a knock came upon Greville's door. A young boy, barely 12, handed him a folded note, eyes darting nervously before he disappeared back into the fog-laden streets. Greville broke the seal, his eyes scanning the hurried script. "Beware. The king knows. He fortifies Whitehall. Plans are made to strike before you do." Greville's fists clenched. Time was slipping away. He gathered his most trusted advisers, men who had served Elizabeth with pride and had sworn to see her legacy protected. They spoke in hushed tones, voices laced with both fear and fire. "We move tonight," Greville declared. "If the king knows of our plans, then we have no choice but to act now. There is no room for hesitation." The night was heavy with anticipation. Greville's forces, clad in dark cloaks, moved through the city with practiced silence. Alleyways became arteries, carrying armed men closer and closer to the walls of Whitehall. The air was sharp with the promise of conflict, and every shadow seemed to whisper of betrayal. At Whitehall, James waited, surrounded by guards. His eyes flickered with both fear and resolve. He had fortified the palace, placed sentries at every gate, and ordered the doors locked and barred. "They will come," he murmured to Walden, his gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight. "And when they do, we shall be ready." Outside the palace walls, Greville and his men assembled in the misty dark. His heart thundered with purpose. He raised his hand, signaling his men forward. A single lantern was lit, a beacon in the fog. It was time. The first clash came swiftly. Greville's men struck at the outer guards, shadows in the moonlight, blades flashing in silence. The gates of Whitehall trembled under the force of iron and flame, and the cry of alarm rang out into the night. War had come to London, not from foreign shores, but from the heart of its own people. The night erupted into chaos. Whitehall's walls, once symbols of royal dominion, now reverberated with the clashing of steel and the shouts of defiance. Greville's forces, emboldened by their cause, surged forward with a fury born of desperation and conviction. Flames flickered from torches, casting long, dancing shadows upon the cobblestone streets, while the echoes of combat thundered through the city. James I, ensconced within the fortified palace, paced with measured urgency. His advisers, pale with fear, clustered near him, whispering strategies and prayers in equal measure. Outside, the din grew louder, a rolling tide of rebellion that crashed against Whitehall's defenses. James turned to Sir Francis Walden, his expression hardened. "They must not breach these walls," he declared, voice taut with command. "Send the guards. Every last man." Walden nodded, his jaw clenched. "As you wish, Your Majesty." He spun on his heel, barking orders to the soldiers clustered in the antechamber. The guardsmen, armed and armored, moved with purpose, their footsteps echoing like drumbeats as they descended the staircases and took their positions behind the great iron gates. Outside, Greville spurred his men forward. "To the gates," he roared, brandishing his sword. His eyes blazed with the fire of rebellion, the promise of a restored England flickering in his gaze. His men answered with a thunderous cry, their weapons raised high as they charged the entrance, iron against iron, splinters of wood bursting forth as the heavy doors groaned beneath the assault. Arrows rained from the ramparts, cutting through the night with deadly precision. Greville ducked low, his blade flashing as he deflected the blows of a guardsman who rushed him. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, loyalty against conviction, before Greville's blade found its mark. The guard crumpled, and Greville pressed forward. Meanwhile, within the palace, James listened to the sounds of battle with an air of grim resolve. "They will break upon our defenses like waves upon stone," he murmured, his eyes distant. "They forget, they fight not just against me, but against the crown itself. Against the divine right that has ordained this rule." Walden stepped forward, his voice low and urgent. "But they fight with the spirit of Elizabeth, Your Majesty. That is no small fire to extinguish." James's gaze snapped to Walden, his expression unyielding. "Then we shall snuff it out, Walden. We shall drown it in blood if we must." He raised his hand, signaling to a cluster of guards flanking the great doors of the throne room. "Ready yourselves. If they breach the gates, we will meet them here. England will not fall to shadows and whispers." Outside, the battle raged. Greville's men fought with the ferocity of those who knew their cause was righteous. The iron gates buckled and splintered under the relentless assault. Greville himself led the charge, sword swinging with the precision of a man long trained for war. "For England! For Elizabeth!" he shouted, his voice rising above the cacophony. At last, with a shattering groan, the gates of Whitehall gave way. Greville surged forward, his army flooding into the courtyard like a river unleashed. The defenders fell back, scrambling to regroup as Greville's forces pressed on, cutting through the resistance with practiced efficiency. Inside the throne room, James steeled himself, his hand resting on the hilt of his own sword. Walden stood beside him, his face drawn and pale. "They are here," he whispered. James nodded. "Then let them come. I will not yield." The final confrontation was upon them, the legacy of Elizabeth and the dawn of James's rule balanced precariously on the edge of a blade. Greville stormed through the shattered gates of Whitehall, his men at his back like a wave of shadow and steel. The clash of swords rang out through the marble halls, echoing off the walls with a metallic rhythm. Guards fell back in retreat or fought with desperation, their loyalty to James tested by the sheer force of Greville's assault. Flames flickered in the sconces lining the corridors, casting long shadows across tapestries that depicted the triumphs of Tudor rule, victories that now seemed distant echoes of a golden age. Greville pressed forward, his sword slick with the blood of those who stood in his path. His eyes were fixed on the throne room doors, the final barrier between him and the man he considered an usurper. Outside, the streets of London seethed with whispers and speculation. Word of the battle at Whitehall spread like wildfire, and crowds gathered, straining to catch sight of the skirmish. Merchants abandoned their stalls, apprentices clambered onto barrels for a better view, and nobles watched from the safety of carriage windows, their expressions tight with fear and curiosity. In the heart of Whitehall, the throne room doors loomed before Greville and his men. The iron-bound wood was scarred from countless confrontations, a testament to the monarchy's enduring grip on power. Greville paused, breathing heavily as he wiped sweat and soot from his brow. His eyes blazed with purpose. "We end this now," he said, voice low but resolute. With a nod to his lieutenants, the doors were rammed with the force of iron-capped battering poles. The wood groaned and splintered, hinges straining under the assault. Behind the doors, James I stood with his most loyal guards flanking him. His hand rested on the gilded hilt of his ceremonial sword, eyes fixed on the barricaded entrance. "They think to unseat me," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "But they forget, I am England now." Sir Francis Walden, at James's side, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Your Majesty, we must consider a retreat, at least to the inner chambers." "We can." "No." James snapped, his voice sharp as flint. "I will not flee from shadows. I will face them as a king should." He turned to his guards, nodding once. "Hold your ground. For crown and country." Outside, the battering continued. Greville watched with narrowed eyes as the wood began to splinter and crack. His men, faces grim and determined, drove the poles forward with renewed vigor. With one final heave, the great doors of Whitehall burst open, shattering inward in a cascade of wood and iron. Greville stepped forward, his blade gleaming in the firelight. The throne room was silent, save for the crackle of distant flames. James stood tall, his crown glinting atop his brow, eyes sharp with defiance. "You come to take what is mine," he called out, his voice carrying across the room. "You come to disrupt the order of this land, to unravel the peace I have woven." Greville stepped forward, his gaze unyielding. "We come to restore England to its rightful course. To purge the foreign hand that seeks to twist its fate." His men fanned out behind him, blades at the ready, eyes fixed on the king and his guards. James's lip curled into a sneer. "Elizabeth is gone. Her time has passed. This is my kingdom now." Greville shook his head. "England belongs to its people, not to a foreign throne." With that, he raised his sword, pointing it directly at James. "Yield now, and you will be spared. Fight, and this hall will be your tomb." The room tensed, silence hanging thick and suffocating. James's eyes flickered with a flash of something, fear, or perhaps just recognition of the gravity of the moment. He straightened his back, his grip tightening on his sword. "I will not yield. If this is to be my end, I shall face it with steel in hand." Greville nodded, a flicker of respect passing over his features. "So be it." The hall erupted into chaos as steel met steel, the clash of blades and the cries of men filling the space with the raw sound of battle. Greville surged forward, his sword slicing through the defenses of the nearest guard. Blood sprayed across the polished stone, and the battle was joined. James fought with surprising ferocity, his blade flashing with each parry and strike. Greville pressed him hard, their swords locking, eyes meeting with the fire of conviction. "This is for England," Greville snarled, shoving James back with a burst of strength. "And this is for the crown," James retorted, swinging his blade in a wide arc. Their clash echoed through the chamber, a battle not just of men but of legacies. Outside the throne room, the rebellion raged, but within these walls, it was king against usurper, legacy against legacy, and the very soul of England hung in the balance. The throne room blazed with the intensity of clashing steel, the air thick with the sharp tang of sweat and blood. Greville and James circled each other, their swords weaving arcs of silver through the dim light of flickering torches. The rebellion had breached Whitehall, and now it came down to this, a duel of honor, of legacy, of England's very soul. Greville swung with calculated precision, his blade cutting through the air, meeting James's parries with a ringing clatter that echoed off the stone walls. "You cannot rule a nation that does not accept you." Greville spat, driving James back step by step. His eyes were sharp with conviction, his movements honed by years of conflict and strategy. James's expression twisted with both fury and defiance. "I was chosen by God, anointed by divine right. You think your rebellion can rewrite what is ordained?" His blade met Greville's with a shuddering clang, sparks leaping from the point of contact. Outside the throne room, the battle raged on. Greville's men pressed through the palace halls, overwhelming guards who had stood loyal to James. The corridors echoed with shouts of triumph and cries of despair, the very walls trembling with the weight of civil war. Swords flashed, armor clanged, and the scent of fire drifted through the air as torches were overturned and tapestries ignited. Within the throne room, the duel reached its fevered pitch. James lunged, his blade slicing through the air, narrowly missing Greville's side. Greville countered with a deft parry, driving his shoulder into James's chest and sending him staggering back. The king stumbled, his grip faltering for just a moment, but a moment was all Greville needed. With a surge of momentum, Greville advanced, his sword flashing in a deadly arc. James deflected the blow but was driven back toward the grand throne that loomed behind him, its gilded frame shimmering ominously in the firelight. Greville's eyes flicked to the throne for the briefest of moments, the symbol of power, of control, so close and yet still beyond his grasp. James's expression hardened, his knuckles widening around the hilt of his sword. "You think you can simply erase me? Undo the will of God and country?" he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. Greville shook his head, his breath coming heavy. "I don't need to erase you. History will do that for me. England remembers its true monarchs, and it forgets its pretenders." With a roar of defiance, James charged, his blade flashing with desperation. Greville met him head-on, their swords locking, faces mere inches apart. For a heartbeat, the two men stood locked in mortal struggle, eyes blazing with purpose. Then, with a twist of his wrist and a surge of strength, Greville disarmed the king, sending his sword clattering across the stone floor. James staggered back, his chest heaving, eyes wide with disbelief. "It cannot end like this," he whispered, voice trembling. Greville stepped forward, his sword leveled at the fallen king. "It already has," he replied, his tone resolute. "Yield now, and I will see you sent back to Scotland with your life. Resist, and Whitehall will be your tomb." For a long, breathless moment, silence settled over the throne room. Outside, the sounds of battle waned as Greville's forces secured the palace. Men shouted orders, captives were rounded up, and the echo of triumph began to ripple through the halls. But here, in the heart of power, destiny held its breath. James looked around, his gaze lingering on the throne, on the tapestries that depicted the victories of Tudor kings and queens. His shoulders slumped, and the fire in his eyes dimmed. "Do with me what you will," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The throne is yours." Greville lowered his blade, nodding to his men who stepped forward to seize the fallen monarch. James did not resist as they bound his hands, his eyes fixed on the gilded throne that had slipped from his grasp. Greville watched in silence as James was led away, the echoes of his footsteps fading into the shadows of Whitehall. The rebellion was over, the throne reclaimed, and the dawn of a new era stretched out before them. Greville stood alone for a moment, the weight of history heavy upon his shoulders. He turned slowly, stepping toward the throne, its surface gleaming with the promise of restored sovereignty. Greville placed his hand upon the armrest, his eyes closing for just a moment. "For Elizabeth," he whispered, and with that, he took his place upon the throne of England. The sun rose slowly over the fog-laden streets of London, its light cutting through the haze with a pale, shimmering glow. The city stirred with cautious whispers and muffled conversations. Merchants opened their stalls with hesitant glances toward Whitehall, where the rebellion had reached its bloody climax. For the first time in months, the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral tolled not in mourning, but in a solemn declaration: an era had ended, and a new chapter had begun. Greville sat upon the throne, the weight of its legacy settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of iron. Around him, the remnants of the Tudor court gathered, their faces pale and drawn from the conflict that had stormed through the palace. His eyes swept over them, searching for signs of betrayal, of disloyalty, but he found only solemn acceptance. Elizabeth's spirit, it seemed, had returned to Whitehall in the hearts of those who remained. Sir Francis Walden, though spared the fate of exile, stood quietly to one side, his gaze cast downward. Greville regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "You served James with loyalty, even as the kingdom burned around him. Why do you stand here now, in this hall, under my rule?" Walden raised his eyes, his expression resolute. "I serve the crown, not the man. If you wear it, I shall serve you." His voice did not waver, and Greville saw in him the spark of old loyalty, the kind that had kept England strong under Elizabeth's reign. "Then serve you shall," Greville replied, his voice firm. "But know this, England's heart belongs to its people, not to the whims of kings. We restore Elizabeth's legacy, her spirit of sovereignty and strength." The room nodded in unison, whispers of agreement flickering through the gathered nobles. Outside, the streets of London filled with murmurs of change. News of James's exile spread quickly, carried on the tongues of merchants and beggars alike. Some rejoiced openly, praising the restoration of English pride, while others held their silence, uncertain of what Greville's rule would bring. But there was no denying the shift. The air itself seemed lighter, the shadows of foreign rule now scattered to the wind. In the weeks that followed, Greville solidified his hold on the throne. Letters were sent to the distant corners of England, bearing the seal of his newfound reign. Promises of stability and prosperity echoed the sentiments of Elizabeth's golden age. Taxes were restructured, trade agreements revisited, and the influence of Scottish advisers waned to nothing more than distant memory. Yet, Greville's rise was not without cost. The rebellion had left scars, families torn by conflict, estates burned in the throes of battle. Greville moved swiftly, ensuring reparations were made, that those who suffered would find solace in the new order. His actions, calculated and deliberate, began to win the hearts of even those who had doubted him. Elizabeth's memory was honored with grand ceremonies, statues erected in her likeness, and her name etched into the very stones of Whitehall. Greville ensured that her spirit would never fade, that her legacy would remain intertwined with the heart of England. Under his watch, the kingdom began to heal, its wounds closing under the careful touch of measured leadership. James, meanwhile, was sent back to Scotland, his claim to the English throne shattered and his ambition stifled. There, he would live out his days as a king of diminished power, his dreams of unification scattered like ash upon the wind. On the anniversary of Elizabeth's death, Greville stood before the gathered crowd in the heart of London. His voice rang clear and strong. "Today, we honor the Queen who gave her life to England. We honor the strength, the courage, and the legacy of Elizabeth Tudor." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in unison to chant her name. And so, England marched forward, its heart restored, its throne reclaimed. Greville ruled with the iron resolve of Elizabeth and the promise of a brighter dawn. Whitehall, no longer shadowed by foreign influence, stood as a beacon of sovereignty, its halls echoing with the memory of the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth I, though gone from this world, remained eternal in the hearts of her people, a legacy that neither time nor turmoil could ever erase.